Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Hi everybody, welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. I'm delighted to be here at SAP Sapphire, here in my hometown of Orlando, where we're going to talk procurement with Baber Farooq. Baber is the Senior Vice President of Market Strategy and Procurement Solutions at SAP. Thank you very much for joining us, Baber.
Well, thank you for having me here again.
Likewise, we did this last year, so yeah. I'm interested to kind of see what we're going to talk about today is the latest Economist research that SAP has commissioned. So it's going to be interesting to see how things have changed over the last 12 months.
Indeed.
But before we do, now I know I asked you this question last year, but for anybody who didn't listen, I am going to ask this question again. And that's, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
It's a great question. I think procurement found me is probably the way I would say it. I studied engineering in university. I did a couple of internships in it. This was civil engineering, so it was structural and building and concrete and stuff. And it was interesting, but it wasn't something that I enjoyed practicing much. I also, at the same time, had delved into computer science, right? So, at the time, Ariba was recruiting on campus, and it seemed like a fun little thing to, sign up for and see if I, go through the interview process. I was lucky enough to get called, and they explained what was procurement to me in a nutshell, and it sounded interesting. I actually think they gave, if I remember correctly, I think the example they gave was Disney World sourcing cups. Okay. Right? Which, being in Orlando, I think is really...
And, being a user and a frequent user of Disneyland cups or Disney World cups, they go through a few.
I was hooked. I was like, I get that. I've used those before, right? But it was, the rest is history. And, I started off as a consultant. I probably still didn't fully appreciate and understand what procurement was for several years, even into a little bit of consulting, because it sort of builds and builds and builds, and then you understand, this is what's going on, this is the value, and this is the impact that you can have in an organization, right? But couldn't be happier that procurement found me, all those years ago.
Well, I think when I was looking at your LinkedIn bio, one of the things it said is that you have a passion to make procurement awesome.
Yeah.
I wonder what's exciting you right now about the future of procurement?
I think the fact that procurement has such an elevated role in organizations. I think we, of all the people who have been in procurement, have always appreciated this. Yeah. But I think at times of crises and at times of uncertainty, the importance of the function gets elevated. I think we saw this in 2008. I think we're seeing it again. We saw this again sort of in the pandemic. And now, when post-pandemic forces are manifesting themselves, we're seeing it again now. Yeah. That I think leaders in various sectors of a company are realizing the importance of the procurement function and how it can help deliver the goals of an organization. So that I think makes it a fascinating place to be, and it makes it fascinating for us to try and build solutions that deliver awesome results for organizations.
And we're going to go into some of the research across different offices within the C-suite, but I think that one of the interesting things for procurement is that we, in times of crisis, the procurement is definitely there to help the business, whether it's expense management, whether it's risk management. As we kind of cycle and the business cycle changes, then there's this risk that procurement kind of gets put away and isn't that relevant again until there's another crisis. Now, you talk to a lot of people who are non-procurement C-suite executives. Are you seeing that this time around, kind of the role of procurement is sticking within the businesses that you talk to?
I think one of the reasons in the research we didn't just survey CPOs is because we want to understand what is that perspective that the broader peer groups have with the procurement function. And what's really interesting, I think there's one graph that you see in the report where it says, well, the importance of the procurement function, and then, how you rate their collaboration, and there's like this, there's this gap, right? So everyone knows the importance, but then, the peer groups and even CPOs themselves are saying we need to get better at collaboration. So we can call that, I've been sort of calling that the confidence gap, right? I think if procurement can seize the opportunity and bridge and fill that confidence gap, then they'll have a seat at the table beyond the time frame of the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing right now. The reason, the crises that we're facing right now, primarily I think post-pandemic, but then also right now associated with the pressures of inflation, the sort of knee-jerk reaction of the C-suite will be, okay, let's talk to procurement, let's get costs under control, let's get risks under control. Those are the go-to areas that you will always look to procurement on from a financial and supply chain perspective to get under control. So you can't kind of ignore that. And that's still going to be top of mind, top of agenda. But then procurement knows that it has so much more to offer, right? And it's an opportunity to use delivering outcomes on these measures of risk and cost as the means to also highlight the great work you can do on, innovating with suppliers, on meeting, Scope 3 emission standards, on diversifying the supplier base, on all these other initiatives where procurement can make an impact, kind of gets put on the back burner, right, as great initiatives but never prioritized. But if you can achieve results in those domains while also delivering the promise or delivering the asks, that the organization has put upon procurement around risk and cost, then you can really, really, make sure that the mandate remains sustainable. No pun intended.
It's always interesting. Like we see that as well, and we talk about how expense management and also to risk management to some extent is the invite for procurement. However, it's what we do in the other areas of value creation that will determine ultimately whether a business decides that this is an area, a function, that should stick around essentially. If we go in there and we only focus on those things in service of helping short-term problems and challenges, then procurement gets put back away until the challenges arise again. You've got to take that opportunity to actually show that you can deliver a whole lot more, while of course delivering on the things that are important now.
100%. And I think progress is being made. I think progress was made through the amazing work that procurement and supply chain organizations did during the pandemic. I mean, I think Pfizer has stated the criticality of procurement in terms of helping on the co-ideation and the distribution. Vaccine procurement was such a remarkable problem all over the world during the process. And I think even in the survey, there's this interesting tidbit that we noticed that, between these 2 years, at least in our survey results, and there is statistical significance behind this, you've seen this, that, an increase in terms of the procurement function reporting directly to the CEO versus a year before, right? So that is clearly an indication that there are strategic imperatives that procurement can bring to the table. Otherwise, you would probably leave it with finance or with operations, right? So I think the opportunity is there. We have some runs on the board that are moving in that direction. Yeah, we have to, answer the invitation, but then keep making sure that the value we bring beyond risk and cost can be realized, measured, and broadcast, to an organization.
Yeah, I think that's really promising as well, that procurement, increasingly more procurement teams are reporting to the CEO as opposed to a CFO or a COO or various different offices within the business, because ultimately that's the role that we want to play, and that gives us more of that big picture. When it comes to that confidence gap, I think sometimes that confidence gap is because we're focused on the solving the needs of the person that procurement reports to, and that may not be the needs of the business.
Yes, right.
When I think about that gap, because that gap of it's something that stood out to me as well in the research of, we kind of know that we're not necessarily aligning with the needs of the business. How are you seeing the teams that you work with kind of close that gap so that they are working on things that ultimately is important cross-business, not just necessarily to one functional area?
I think there's a couple of things, right? So, and if I may, I'll talk about our products for a second, right? Because I think this research, we're trying to make sure that we learned from it last year, this year, and in terms of how we're going to impact our products. First of all, you have to measure and talk about the other stuff, right? I mean, you cannot just keep talking about cost and risk as your achievements and then expect that people should know about all the other stuff, right? So, one of the things that we've talked about and we're building towards is a category management solution. It's one of the announcements we've made at our Spend Connect Live conference last year. It's something that is now launched in market this year. And what does that mean? That means that the ability to actually recognize, highlight, report on, and measure the goals that you say you're going to achieve.
Yep.
And of course, 2 of those goals will be associated with costs and
Yep.
risk, but there will be others
Yep.
that are relevant to the organization. So you want to constantly be reporting the outcomes back to the organization in real time. Procurement has always done this or tried to do this. It's just kind of been something that you put on a PowerPoint at the start of the year, you file away, you try to dig it back at the end of the year, and it's not as impactful when it just becomes part of a reporting cadence.
Sometimes you get blamed for being too salesy or too marketing, and I think that procurement, as a lot of procurement organizations struggle with actually cheerleading for themselves in terms of actually demonstrating the value that's been created, which is some of the reason that leads to the disconnect between what the perception of the value is versus the actual value that's delivered.
100%. And then, in that same line, I think we want to make sure that from a technology perspective, all the capabilities for collaboration are present. And procurement needs to stop getting viewed as a police officer in the process, right? And I think that's still the perception that most business functions have of procurement. They know the role, they know the importance, that's fun, but they kind of like, well, let me get everything done up front as much as I possibly can.
Before I involve
the police officers who will tell me the 19 problems that I have to go fix now, right? And look, some of that is important. Like, of course, we're talking about risk. There is an element of checking and making sure that compliance standards are being met. You cannot underrate that, and I don't think procurement should ever run away from that, right? But I think if speed and agility can be brought into the process, and a willingness to sort of show and share best practices can be brought into the process, then I think it'll help the business buy in and engage. And I think categories of purchasing are getting so sophisticated and complex. I don't think business functions necessarily realize how much expertise sits in procurement. To be able to say, hey, have you thought about adding this to the contract? Have you thought about this sort of benefit that you can get from the supplier? Have you thought about setting this type of an arrangement for reviews up with the supplier? And all of these things are going to add value to the business that they don't always necessarily realize. So the more and more procurement does that, both through technology and through practice, let yourself shine, let the expertise shine, the more we'll start bridging that confidence gap.
Yeah, because it really, some of the things that we work on are because either we believe that that's what the business wants without actually knowing, but once you truly align, then if you are being the policeman, that's because ultimately that's the mandate that the organization needs, because perhaps it's a really small margin business that's having difficulties and requires it, but at least everybody's on board with it. I think the challenge is we kind of take that approach whether the business needs it or not.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Now, as you did the survey, I know we kind of alluded to the fact that you surveyed CEOs, Chief Supply Chain Officers, CFOs, a number of folks across the C-suite. What were some of the challenges or the top of mind that the respondents were thinking about in terms of where their focus is this year?
Well, inflation is definitely, there's no doubt about it, at the absolute top of the agenda, right? I mean, I think it's been an interesting 2 years, right? Because I think when we did the survey last year, inflation was in check. The stock market was booming. The valuation of tech stocks was very high. There was no war in Ukraine. I mean, the survey was in market in 2022 in January, February. This was all, things changed very quickly.
Just before the Ukraine war, the war started in Ukraine.
And I remember that it sort of published, I think it was May, and I went to my boss, I'm like, it's already out of date, right? So it's interesting that when, we ended up, doing the survey again in this year, that it was very, very clear that the pressures around inflation and the struggles with the war in Ukraine have been clearly top of mind, and it gets reflected in the survey, obviously, with some things like with customers, and executives highlighting clearly that costs are a problem, risk are a problem, but you also then notice it on the most interesting, actually the stat in the survey that's most fascinating, and I keep reading it over and over again because I cannot believe it, is that last year, the number one driver for digital transformation was user experience. And that was not a surprise. That has been the case for several years. We've been hearing it for probably a decade, right? Get on mobile, make it easier for me.
Easier buying experience.
Easier buying experience, Amazon-like experience, 3 clicks and I go, and that's what my business stakeholders want, et cetera. And we've been hearing it over and over again. This year, the number one driver for digital transformation was spend visibility. Right? Let me know what I'm buying, where I'm buying it. Supply chain visibility. Give me a view of my supply chain. It was number 6 last year, and it became number 1 this year within a 12-month time frame. That is a remarkable jump, right?
Do you feel that that's driven by organizations that don't have any visibility into spend and supply chain, or whether it's driven by those that have it but they realized it wasn't enough and they're actually wanting to go to the next level?
I think it's the latter, if I had to guess. I mean, if I was to make a prediction based on, I think, over the past 10, 15 years, through various tools and capabilities, organizations have,
Because that was always interesting to me. When
through
you
Excel,
see it, you think,
through Excel and other tools that are out there have figured out some spend reporting that works for them. I think they're just saying it's not good enough. I think there's many sources of spend. I want to be able to report on all of it. It needs to be current, right? I mean, I was talking to a CPO last year when the Suez Canal crisis happened, and it became symbolic of this moment where procurement can get in and supply chain officers can sort of signify the importance. And this particular chief procurement officer said, well, my CEO called me. He's like, do we have any supply on that ship? Was the question. He's like, I don't know, right? But it sort of, he said, I thought my reporting was very good until I got that request, and then I was making 15 million phone calls trying to get to the answer. So I think it's not so much that there's not any visibility. I think they're saying it needs to be better. And I think it's also sort of representative of, if I can say, maybe a general level of frustration with enterprise software that organizations have, which is that on the one hand, we're talking about robots taking over the world and everything being written automatically through ChatGPT. And on the other hand, I have all this data. I just want to report on where things are, what my supply chain is like. Give me 2-3 tiers down of any vulnerabilities that are there. And I can't seem to get it, right? So I think that dissonance sort of leads to this type of feedback in the survey.
And it was interesting on that point. I seem to recall that one of the other drivers was actually category management. As you talked about category management before, that's been an area for procurement where technology hasn't really existed. I think it's been the last area of the cycle of procurement for us to invest in and to look at. And so now organizations are starting to look at, how do I take it off a PowerPoint where I'm putting together a category strategy and presenting it to all my stakeholders, to it being much more of a collaborative, kind of ongoing, continuous process.
And the actions that are supposedly driving that strategy can be taken from within the technology. And that's one of the reasons that we're very strongly believing in some of the capabilities that we're investing in right now, because we want to make sure we bridge that last mile for organizations.
What do you see as some of the barriers to digitization that came up in the survey?
Well, the one barrier that caught my eye more than anything else was the ease of deployment. It's a bit of a shame, actually, I think, right? Because software implementation is still much harder than people feel it should be. I mean, the most relatable experiences are when you buy a new iPhone or you buy a new television. You literally plug it, and with the iPhone, I always am fascinated by when you get a new iPhone now, and it sort of says, I don't know, take a picture of your old phone and I'll transfer all the data, right?
It's just like your old one in 10 minutes.
It's just like, well, how did that happen, right? And it's inspiring, right? To me, as someone who is looking at technology and the way it should operate, it's inspiring. Now, I know enterprise software is much more complicated than that. There's customized rules and industry benchmarks and stuff, so you can't meet that same standard. But oh God, it should be much easier to deploy than it is right now, right? And I think it's probably a criticism of the industry at large. So, and I think what was interesting was that was the number one barrier listed by the chief financial officer. Not like, people that are CIOs, not like CIOs, right? But and probably because the CFO is cutting the checks.
He doesn't want to pay for it.
This keeps getting harder and harder. But it's really a shame that we can't make it easier. So that's one of those elements of investment that we're making in terms of modernizing our platform, embedding services automatically within the product, capabilities that customers should be able to do, with a few clicks that maybe required a few phone calls before. And we're recognizing, the way I would say it is that we talk about designing for personas, even in our user experience, you know, the sourcing manager, the category manager, the casual user, you know, the marketing, you know, buyer is going to be very different. You have to cater your product and the user experience for these different personas, and you know, the deployment persona and the support persona are no longer second-class citizens, right? They have to absolutely be first-class citizens to break that barrier and make it easier. It's never going to become the iPhone, right? That example, but it needs to be a lot better and easier than it is today.
It's some of the complexity because from a procurement, but the procurement, you know, kind of the infrastructure, the procurement tech infrastructure, let's say, connects with so many different areas of the business that actually forces some of the complexity that comes with it.
I mean, there was another chief procurement officer I was speaking to last year, and he sort of reminded me in a very delicate fashion. He's like, you know, yes, you know, just I want you to understand, SAP is great and it's huge and it's large and it's very powerful and we have it, but there's like 28 other applications that make up what is our procurement landscape, right? And you know, one of the things we launched a partnership with iCertis last year. And there's a few more we may launch this year. And at the heart of it is this idea that despite how great SAP is or how great we feel it is, we have to play in the sandpit with everyone, right? So whether you want to call it API first but the idea that you need to be interchangeable as a product with other systems. You know, preferentially with some of your partners, but also other players out there and other software applications out there that will not be SAP, and it needs to be able to consume and distribute data to those systems to make it easier for the end goal of the procurement organization.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what we see is, you know, you think about how do you get competitive advantage through your procurement technology stack. And a lot of times it's going to be like, how do I do things differently than my competitor? Because that's where the advantage comes from. And so giving people the ability to really customize their experience based on using a number of different tools that make up a tech stack allows them to essentially build something that's unique to their business.
100%. I mean, I think, you know, I was just speaking to someone who said, you know, there's a lot of things that should not be unique, right, in the enterprise software landscape. And I think the entire idea of grow with SAP and public cloud and the don't make it special, don't make it custom, right, and remove as many things as you can that need to be custom, right? But then there's going to be some bit that's going to be unique to you, and that's your competitive advantage. And I think that's also the case with procurement based on whatever your industry is, based on whatever your business is. There's probably some element of procurement that may be custom, right? But you want to standardize everything else around the edges.
Yeah, 80% of procurement is the same in every business.
Exactly right.
And so it's about the 20%. It's customizing the 80%, and then the 20% is where the uniqueness comes from.
Correct. If your product is 80-90% customized, it's time to take a look and understand what's going on. And I think that idea of ease of deployment and support stretches into this idea for our customers. It's not just about software systems like SAP as in terms of getting them deployed, but it's also about how complicated are you making the usage of the product itself, right? Are you putting in too many approval rules? Are you putting in too many workflows in the process that are going to make it, are there too many questions you're asking in the onboarding experience? Supplier onboarding, the number of times that gets mentioned, and supplier relationship management was also very starkly called out in the survey as an area where peer leaders are saying that procurement needs to do a better job of having relationships with their suppliers, and then they're kind of also saying, isn't that kind of your only job? So like, why would you not do it well, right? But I think, you know, the idea that suppliers are unhappy at a time where inflation is high and supply is low can be a problem for an organization, right? So
on the flip side, it's definitely an advantage to have strong relationships,
100%.
as we're being proven. And when you need that relationship, if you don't have it, it's too late.
So if your onboarding process has been designed to be very cumbersome, the technology will do it. The technology will let you ask 90 questions, right? You know, and you can even make that easy to implement, right? So you can make it easy to put 90 questions in there, right? But you know, as an organization, you want to really ask yourself if that's the right thing to do.
Right? That's a mindset shift as well sometimes, because I think we've moved from the suppliers exist to help me do my business, and they should be happy to get the check that I send them, to we really need to be driving collaboration. It's all around relationships. It's that they're an extension of my business. And those that think in that way are obviously the ones that when you have difficulties like inflation and risks, that their suppliers are there to help them, but also the ones that are bringing all the innovative ideas on how they can grow their products over their competitors.
And suppliers are a means of innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if there was another customer I was speaking to in the automotive sector, and she was telling me that 98% of the innovations in my cars is driven by my suppliers. It is not us. We put it together at the end, right? And when you sort of appreciate that and realize that for a second, wow, well, you better be treating them well.
Right? Yeah, no, I echo that. Back in my early days, I was a new program buyer in automotive, and that's where all of the innovation came from. So our job was to enable that and encourage it as much as possible. And I worked in pharma as well. And even though the huge R&D budgets within pharma, we always say that your suppliers, you could be the biggest spender of R&D in the world, but your suppliers many multiples more than that.
Yeah.
And so it's about tapping into that.
Yep, exactly right.
Now, some of the things that are always on mind of a CEO, growth, for example. Now, do you see that as this report has shown inflation and risk management being center stage, has that been at the detriment of things like growth and focus on sustainability? Or are we in this world now where it's just there's more to focus on?
That's a really good question. I think when we talk about issues like sustainability, it is definitely not at the top of the list right now, right? I mean, now, that is, I think, a reaction to the inflationary pressures and the risk concerns that are there. I think it is imperative for procurement leaders to understand that if we look into the future, we need to have solutions for carbon emissions. We need to have solutions for the risk of slavery in supply chains. And they are best suited to drive that change. So when we were talking earlier about, use this as an invitation to continue to make positive momentum in those areas that are highly strategic, that is a perfect example of doing so. I think it's fair to say that it's not top of mind just because of the force by which inflation has arrived in the world and the importance of cost containment pressure, at least as far as this survey is concerned. But I think when the report itself will also highlight that this is an area of concern that everyone should be aware of, because you cannot really take your foot off the gas on this front. You have to somehow establish a balance by, while you're delivering results in the areas of cost and risk management, that you're still realizing that you have to, the entire theme of this conference at Sapphire is future proof, right? So future proofing an organization, this is a perfect example of what procurement organizations can do. And future proofing, to some extent, by definition, is sort of realizing the things that may not be at the very top of the mandate, but are the ones that as a business owner are going to become impactful at some point in the future, and you have to prepare now. I don't know if there's anyone serious will say if there's going to be a world 10 years from now where we're not going to have carbon regulation around the world, right? We are already seeing increased amounts of regulations around slavery and supply chains. That is going to get increased, that is going to be more stringent. It's also the right thing to do, right? So, I think procurement organizations need to seize this moment and this opportunity to drive the agenda for their organizations on those fronts and prepare your organization for those impending legislations that are out there. It's not just an initiative on sustainability that's a feel-good initiative. It is preparing your organizations for a future world from the perspective of organizational and financial security. Yeah,
and you think back to where we started when we talked about visibility, and it's that visibility, that's the missing piece at the moment, is having the visibility to understand in your supply chain where the red flags are in terms of modern slavery, or where the Scope 3 emissions, or making decisions on the Scope 3 emissions. So getting that visibility helps then start to drive decision making, which can really increase the value that procurement brings to the organization in those areas.
100%.
So I'm going to wrap up with one last question. Okay. So we start here again next year, in 2 years' time, the next time you do your survey, what would you have liked to have seen over the next couple of years for procurement?
That's easy, right? Well, firstly, I would like to see the confidence gap decrease, right? Like, that would be really good if within 12 to 24 months we can see, what's interesting about that is you want the top part of that graph to remain very high, which is, what is the importance of procurement in your function? And that's very, very high, right? That all leaders across the board are saying it's an extremely important function. It's reflective of the times, but it's also very high, right? But the second thing you want to end up seeing is you want to see what is your sort of confidence in the ability for procurement to deliver on those promises, and we want to see that rise up higher. That's probably the one thing that I think is most important, because if that's happening, then a lot of the problems we talked about, ease of deployment, et cetera, all of those are being taken care of. The one other thing that I would mention when we talk about these initiatives, other than cost and risk, those start becoming some of the top areas and drivers for change amongst the C-suite for peer groups other than the CPO.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it'll be great.
So
the CPO will mention it, right?
So you're not pushing the boulder uphill anymore. In those
exactly.
areas.
You understand that the chief supply chain officer or even the chief human resources officer, right? They start realizing the value of procurement other than just go get the price down. Right. Those are the two things that I think would be really cool to see.
All right, we'll have to check in the next time. Well, Baber, I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Phil.
We'll include a link to how to download the survey in the show notes for today's episode. So that will be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. And until the next time, Baber, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.
All right, take care.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.